They ruled England for over a century. They broke with Rome, beheaded queens, dissolved monasteries, and stamped their authority onto the very soul of a nation. The Tudors were supposed to be immortal. Not literally, they understood death, but in legacy and monument. In the carefully constructed image of divine authority, they expected permanence. They did not get it. Because centuries after their deaths, the stone floors above their vaults were lifted. Coffins were cracked open. Bodies were moved. Hearts were removed and stored in lead containers. And on at least one occasion, a young boy dipped his hand into what remained of a queen's preserved heart and described what he felt. What was found when the Tudor coffins were opened did not match the gilded portraits on gallery walls. It did not match the marble effigies lying serenely in Westminster Abbey. It matched something far more unsettling: the raw, physical reality of mortality beneath magnificence. This is the story of what happened when England's most powerful dynasty was forced to confront the one thing it could not command: time. To understand why the opening of these coffins matters, you first have to understand how obsessively the Tudors managed their own image. When Henry VII seized the throne at Bosworth Field in 1485, he inherited a kingdom fractured by decades of civil war. His claim to the crown was shaky. His bloodline was tenuous. So he did what every vulnerable dynasty does. He built monuments, portraits, elaborate ceremonies, permanent markers of legitimacy, carved into stone and stitched into velvet. Death was part of that project. When a Tudor monarch died, the body was opened immediately. Surgeons extracted the intestines, liver, and lungs to slow decomposition. The heart, considered both a biological threat to preservation and a deeply symbolic organ, was removed and sealed in a separate lead casket. The body cavity was packed with herbs and aromatic spices, then wrapped in wax-soaked linen called cerecloth. The corpse was then encased in a lead-lined coffin, sealed within a stone vault, and placed beneath an elaborate tomb. Proclaiming the monarch's virtue and God-given authority, the message was clear. These were not ordinary bodies. These were consecrated vessels of sovereignty. Their resting places were sacred. Their tombs were permanent. Except they weren't. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. At Whitehall Palace, the man who had once been celebrated across Europe for his athletic build and magnetic charisma had become, by his final years, a figure of grotesque physical decline. His leg ulcers were so foul that foreign ambassadors noted the smell in dispatches. His weight was so extreme that mechanical hoists were required to move him. His death was kept secret for 2 days. Under Tudor law, predicting the monarch's death while he still lived was considered treason. Servants continued delivering meals to empty chambers. Stability depended on perception, and perception had to be managed, even across the threshold of death. He was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour. The burial was intended to be temporary. Henry had planned a tomb of extraordinary grandeur, a monument to rival anything on the continent. It was never finished. Political instability during the short reigns of his children, combined with financial strain, left his coffin in a relatively modest vault beneath a plain slab. Then in 1649, the vault was reopened. Parliament had executed King Charles I. Following the English Civil War, a discreet burial was required. No spectacle, no ceremony. They placed him in Henry VIII's vault. When workers opened the chamber, they found Henry's coffin in a disturbing state. The lead casing had cracked. Internal pressure from decomposition gases had forced structural failure. Some observers claimed that beard hair was visible through the breach. The king, who had broken with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, now lay in a fractured container, sharing confined space with a monarch, condemned by a tyrant by his own subjects. Two of England's most turbulent eras collapsed into one cramped stone chamber. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536. There was no elaborate preparation, no grand procession. She was buried the same day in a repurposed arrow chest inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower of London. For 3 centuries she lay there, largely forgotten. The chapel floor above her gradually sank. Graves shifted, remains became intermixed. There were no markers then. In 1848, restoration work required excavation. Builders uncovered multiple skeletons in confused arrangement. Identifying which bones belonged to which person required methodical anatomical work. Doctors described one skeleton belonging to a small woman, approximately 5 feet tall, with a slight frame and evidence of a clean single-blow decapitation. The angle of the severed vertebrae matched historical accounts of her execution by French swordsmen. She was reinterred beneath the altar in a marked coffin. But consider what that process revealed. A queen whose marriage had triggered England's break with Rome, whose trial had reshaped the nation's religious identity, lay for 300 years beneath a chapel floor, so neglected that her bones required forensic deduction to identify. No DNA confirmation, no definitive proof. A tentative identification, based on stature and historical positioning. The legend of Anne Boleyn, whether villain or martyr, depending on who told the story, rested on probability. Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603 at Richmond Palace. She had resisted naming a successor for most of her reign, understanding that uncertainty kept her powerful. She had also reportedly resisted the idea of being opened after death. But tradition prevailed. Her surgeons extracted her organs. Her heart was sealed in velvet and lead. Her body was wrapped and displayed beneath a lifelike effigy. For the funeral procession, one final performance of sovereignty, one last managed spectacle. She was initially buried in the vault of her grandparents, her successor James I, the man who ended Tudor rule entirely, then commissioned a new tomb. Elizabeth's coffin was moved. It was placed in a vault that already contained the remains of her sister, Mary I. The arrangement left Elizabeth's coffin resting directly above Mary's. Whether this was deliberate symbolism or practical convenience has been debated for centuries. Protestant above Catholic, Elizabeth above the sister who had imprisoned her in the Tower and nearly signed her death warrant. The optics were impossible to ignore. Within niches in that same vault sat urns containing what was said to be the preserved hearts of both queens at some point in the 17th century. A choir boy named William Taswell reportedly opened one of those urns. He described dipping his hand into a thick, reddish mortar-like substance, the preserved heart of a monarch, an organ once treated as a sacred relic of sovereignty, had become something a curious child could touch. Look at these cases together and a pattern emerges. Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's acknowledged illegitimate son, elevated to Duke of Richmond and once considered a potential heir, was buried in secrecy when he died aged 17 in 1536. When the monasteries were dissolved for years later, his body was exhumed and relocated to Framlingham. He was moved again when his vault was finally excavated in 1841. Observers noted his teeth were prominently visible. The cerecloth wrappings that should have preserved him had been compromised somewhere along the way. A potential king reduced over centuries to a skeleton with notable teeth. What connects all of these cases is not conspiracy. What connects them is inevitability. Tudor burial practices were sophisticated by 16th century standards. The removal of organs, the use of lead, the layering of aromatic herbs, all of it was designed to resist time. But none of it was designed to resist the English Civil War Victorian restoration projects. Structural deterioration dissolving monasteries, or the natural curiosity of a boy exploring an ancient vault. The Tudors could command armies, they could execute ministers and queens, they could remake the church, but they could not issue orders to future centuries. We began with a question. What was the greatest discovery? When the Tudor coffins were opened, it was not the beard hair. It was not the preserved heart. It was not the tentatively identified bones of an executed queen. The greatest discovery was philosophical. The Tudor dynasty was constructed on the premise that authority was permanent, that royal power derived from God, and therefore transcended ordinary human limitation. Their tombs were architectural arguments for that belief: effigies carved in marble, heraldic shields etched in stone, Latin inscriptions proclaiming divine favor. But beneath those inscriptions, behind those shields, under those effigies, the physical evidence told a different story. Coffins crack, vaults overcrowd. Floors sink, hearts become residue. Bodies become bones, bones get measured, moved and tentatively identified. The Tudors transformed England. That transformation endures in law, religion, and culture. Their achievements are real and lasting, but their bodies, those carefully preserved, ceremonially sealed, symbolically arranged, bodies were subject to the same corrosion as any other. Every portrait of Henry VIII shows a man of absolute command. His actual coffin lay cracked and breached in a cramped vault, sharing space with the king his own dynasty had never anticipated. That contrast is the discovery. Power is theatrical, mortality is not. Beneath every marble effigy lies a body. Beneath every grand inscription lies bone. And beneath every carefully constructed legacy lies the quiet, relentless work of time. The one sovereign no dynasty has ever managed to overthrow. The vaults of Westminster Abbey and Windsor Castle remain largely sealed today. Thousands walk above them daily. Without a second thought, the floors look fixed. The monuments look permanent. They are not in somewhere beneath the stone. The Tudor dynasty waits not in the serene, immortal pose of their effigies, but in the actual condition. Their open coffins revealed human, fragile, subject to time like everyone else. What do you believe is the most revealing discovery? From the open Tutankhamun's tombs, leave your thoughts below and subscribe if this kind of history is what you're here for.